One of the things about Muslim countries, even when things break down, people really do recognize the word brother and sister. Like that word actually means something in many, many places around the world. And I've experienced the beauty of that word, not so much as it's articulated, ya akhi, but the real lived experience of somebody treating you like a brother or like a sister. I was thinking a lot about united against poverty. I actually think it'd be better if we were united against wealth. Because I've actually lived in the poorest countries in the world. I mean, literally the poorest. Like I was in Niger, I was in Mali, I was in Mauritania. I lived in a place in Mauritania where the rich people had all of their possessions in one box, and the poor people didn't have a box. I mean, really. And my own teacher, Marab Tarhaj, may Allah preserve him, he was actually considered relatively wealthy because he had a few cows that were milked every day, and that's where they drank their milk. The milk in Tuemrat is organic milk. It's not pasteurized, homogenized. It's not 1% or zero fat. It's just right out of the udder. So what I noted about living in the poorest places, and I literally lived in a shanty town. I mean, a complete like open sewage. The houses were made out of Chinese tea boxes, literally that were disassembled from tea boxes, and that's how they made their houses. And I lived with a man, Al-Maqari, from the Masuma clan, in his little hut made out of tea cartons. And these were some of the richest people I have ever known. They were rich in community. They were rich in culture. They were people that could quote the greatest Arabic poetry ever written. Most of them memorized the Quran by heart. And for entertainment, they would discuss grammatical points. These were really rich people. They were not impoverished, unless you want to identify poverty as material poverty. And I'm not really against material poverty, but I'm very much against cultural and spiritual poverty. Because I think what's happening in this country is we are the most culturally and spiritually impoverished nation in the world. The fact that the #1 best-selling novel right now is a pornographic novel of no literary merit, according to the critics that have read it. But this is what's happening in America. Every airport I've been to has a whole row of these novels just lined up for people just to devour them off the shelves. That is poverty. It's poverty not to have, if you're from this culture, it's poverty not to have ever read Melville, so that when somebody like Chris Hedges can tell you about the Pequod or Ahab's quest, you don't have any cultural references to know what that means, despite the fact that even the poorest Americans 100 years ago had very often read that book. Because literature is not the property of the wealthy. Historically, literature has actually been the property of the most impoverished people. Some of the greatest writers were impoverished people. Read the life of Edgar Allan Poe, somebody constantly in debt, a drug addict, dealing with the despair of living in the United States at that time, and a lot of his literature is about that, those aspects. Dostoevsky. read about their lives, and yet they produced this great body of literature because they were not culturally impoverished. They may have been materially impoverished, but they were not culturally impoverished. One of the most celebrated authors, one of the most celebrated artists in Western tradition is Van Gogh, and he was a completely impoverished person, supported by his brother, never sold a painting during his own lifetime. Another very tortured person, but somebody who had a richness of vision that people are still entranced by his paintings. So I think that a lot of what's happening in this country is actually from luxuria. It's actually from, luxuria used to be one of the 7 deadly sins. That's the Latin term for lust, luxuria, gluttony and lust. That we're a surfeited culture. We're too full. There's too much. When people talk about the 99 and the 1%, we're 5% of the world's population, and we're devouring most of the world's natural resources. The average American is in the 5%. The other part of the world is the other 95%. So when we're talking about the 1% and the 99%, some of the people in that 1% are drug dealers in inner cities. Really. So the whole dichotomization, this desire to kind of split the world into good people and evil people, to me is a false dialectic that I think as Muslims we should reject. We should reject it. There are wretched, demonic people amongst the poor, and there are decent, angelic people amongst the wealthy. And the Prophet ﷺ had poor people with him, and he had wealthy people, and without the wealthy people, he could not have done what he did for the poor people. But he transformed the motives of the wealthy. He transformed their motives. He didn't create a class warfare. He didn't make the poor people hate the wealthy people or the wealthy people feel contempt for the poor people. No. He gave us a different criterion to judge people. We were talking earlier today about intellectual arrogance, because you see so many people in academia that are filled with intellectual arrogance, a sense of their inherent superiority. Because if you learn even a little bit, you quickly see how far ahead you are from a lot of people out there. And that can lead to a type of contempt, because you have some kind of intellectual training that other people do, because you can work things out quicker than other people can work out, because you know these references and other people don't know these references. But the reality of it is that Islam put a different criterion for excellence than intellectual excellence. It's spiritual excellence. It's being a human being. And that is open to the poorest of the poor and the richest of the rich. And that's what separates people. So that street sweeper, that janitor might have more humanity, ounce per ounce, than that PhD professor at Yale University. He might have better character, more moral integrity. He might be a better father, a better civic member of society. Because the real judge of people in Islam is the judge of character. It's not anything else. The Prophet ﷺ's standard was a standard of character. And he said, in fact, the standard of that standard was how you treat your women. Because he said that a man is judged by how he treats his women. خَيْرُكُمْ خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِهِ وَأَنَا خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِي. The best of you are the best to their women folk or their families, and I'm the best of you to my women folk. So he was letting us know right there what the standard of judgment, how you judge a person. Because you've got all these people out there giving all of their declarations and proclamations and telling you what's right and what's wrong, and they go home and they treat their wife like dirt. They treat their children as if they're subjects of Pharaoh. So the whole stratification, if you're talking about good and evil, give me a break. Because it's all the way down. This whole crisis This global crisis that started here in this country was about greed. It was greed on Main Street and greed on Wall Street. All those people that went in and lied on their applications about how much they were making because they wanted to get that house they didn't even understand what type of mortgage they were getting. They didn't know that it was going to balloon in a few years. They didn't care. They just saw an opportunity to get some property, and maybe it'll rise in price, and in a few years I'll flip it, pay off my debt, and make some money. It was greed. Greed on Main Street and greed on Wall Street. And that's why Islam doesn't talk about the wealthy and the poor. It talks about character. It talks about the moral character of people and how you transform people. You know, I was asked to talk just about the Islamic economic system in relation to the Western economic system or this modern system of capitalism. You can't even compare the two. There's no comparison. Our system is based on real wealth, a bimetal economy in which money actually has intrinsic value. People say gold doesn't have intrinsic value, then why do people kill for it? And the only reason they kill for paper dollars that don't have intrinsic value is because they think that it has intrinsic value. But all you have to do is put a fire to it and you'll see how valuable it is. You put fire to gold and you'll see how valuable it is, because gold's indestructible. Gold doesn't corrode. Silver doesn't corrode. They don't oxidize. The gold coins that were minted by Caesar, you can go down to a store probably here in Stamford and buy one of them if you have enough money, because it's still around. This whole Dajjalic system, fooling people into thinking that worthless paper has any intrinsic value, fractional reserve banking. Abraham Lincoln, when he needed to fund the war, he wanted to borrow money. So he asked the bankers, and they told him, well, it's going to be on this interest rate. So he said, to hell with it. In the Constitution, we can print money. So he printed up greenbacks. That's how he paid for the war. They were non-interest greenbacks that were printed by the U.S. government. Then why today are we borrowing money from a private bank and paying them interest? And the interest now represents 25% of the national debt, because the bankers run the situation. They wrote the laws. They wrote the laws. And people don't know this because they're no longer educated. And if you want to know why it's getting so bad out there, it's a very plain and simple. Because we have ignorant people. We have an ignorant population. And when you have ignorant populations, then you need more and more draconian measures for social control. And this is the history of the world. You just read about it in your history books, and you'll see the same tactics are used to control ignorant people. Educated people are the dangerous ones. It's not ignorant people. You can control ignorant people. Seriously, they're not hard to control. Bread and circus is one way. That's the old-fashioned way. Now it's MTV and McDonald's. That's just a modern version of pan et circus. That's what the Romans used. But it's the same game. You look at what they're devouring on their... Look at the cultural impoverishment of this society. You know, people aren't hungry in this society. They're starving to death. They're starving to death. And they're starving to death even though they're overeating. The reason that they have to eat more and more is because there's no nutrients in the food. So you're wondering why they're all getting bigger and bigger out there? Because the more they eat, the hungrier they feel. They're not satiated. All you have to do, come to California and we'll give them a real meal, like brown rice and tofu, and you'll see how quick they're hungry. They won't be hungry. If you eat a real meal, you go and eat, the Indians eat dal. You don't see fat Indians down in those villages, because they eat dal, they eat real food. They're eating real bread that they cook with their own hands, chapatis. They're eating chapatis, and they're eating dal, and they have better nutrition than all these people out here. They have better nutrition. But when you go up into that 1%, you know what they're eating? They're eating dal and handmade chapatis. Really, they're eating the same stuff the poorest people are eating in a lot of these countries. Go to Malaysia and you see how poor people eat. They're eating real vegetables that they grew. Pakistanis in this country, I know a lot of you know this. Your grandmothers, when they got here, the first thing they did was went in the backyard and started a garden. They grow their own tomatoes to put in their curries because that's just the way they did it. In this country, you used to have what were called victory gardens in World War II. They told people to grow your own gardens. Now, people don't even know what a vegetable is. The closest thing they get to it is a French fries. Really, or pizza. It's because it's got some red under there. I think that's from a vegetable. See, they don't know what vegetables are. Most kids now in the schools can't identify a lot of the vegetables. They can't. They've actually done these tests, and they don't know what a turnip is, or a Brussels sprout, let alone a collard green. See, some people are old enough to know collard greens, right? Because people went out and picked them because they couldn't afford to go down to the store. People were resourceful. This country was a country of resourceful people. There's all these people looking for jobs. People used to make jobs. They didn't look for jobs. They made jobs. Now, people have been so dumbed down and so convinced that they can't do anything, that only if they get this job, and then they go and it's all humiliation. Ibn Khaldun said the two most humiliating ways of gaining a livelihood are employment and treasure hunting. That's what he said, Ibn Khaldun. Employment and treasure hunting. In this country, employment was only just to learn how to do something. You became like a journeyman carpenter, and then when you finished the 7 years, you were free to open your own business. That's the way it worked. You started a store, you worked in a store to see how it ran, and then you went and opened your own shop. That's what people did. My great-grandfather started at the bottom in a newspaper. By his 50s, he owned 3 newspapers. Because that's the way America was. It was about entrepreneurial tradition of people elevating people. Not everybody was in that. That's acknowledged. But even if you look in the black communities in the South, you look what they did, creating their own schools. Lawyers came out of those schools. Some of the best schools now, today, are still out of those schools. You look at people like Du Bois. Look at the level of education that they had. You know, read what his books are considered classics today. So there were people even from the most oppressed communities that still rose above those circumstances and empowered other people to do the same.